Are you ready to learn the truth about what killed Vikings more often than enemy swords or stormy seas? We are used to thinking of them as indestructible warriors with axes, but their main enemy was not a foreign army, but an empty pantry in the middle of an endless polar night. Winter in Scandinavia is not just a season. It is a silent killer that slowly squeezes the icy throat of every fjord dweller. In these lands, where the sun does not rise for months, the ability to preserve a piece of meat was valued more than gold and silver. Their survival depended not on ferocity in battle, but on chemical processes that modern man would consider rot and spoilage. It was a war against nature, where the only weapons were salt, smoke, whey, and the icy wind. A miscalculation of supplies meant not just hunger, but the agonizing death of the entire family before the first spring thaw. Watch the video to the end to find out how a piece of bark could save the life of an entire settlement, and why the Vikings' most terrifying delicacy smelled of death. What if I told you that the greatest battles of the Viking era took place not on the battlefield, but inside their own homes? With the onset of November, the Viking world shrunk to the size of a longhouse, lit only by the dim light of the hearth and seal-fat lamps. Beyond the thin wooden walls, the elements raged, capable of freezing a person in minutes, making any trip outside a deadly risk. In this confined space, saturated with the smell of smoke and unwashed bodies, time flowed differently, turning into a viscous and dangerous substance. People lived in constant anticipation, counting their food supplies and looking with fear at the dwindling barrels of salted fish and meat. The psychological pressure of darkness and monotony was so great that it could drive even the most steadfast and hardened men mad. Every bite of bread or meat was accompanied by the thought of whether there would be enough leftovers until the ice melted from the fjords. Hunger was not just a physical sensation of emptiness in the stomach, but a constant background noise that dictated every decision and action. In such conditions, food ceased to be a source of pleasure and became a sacred resource that kept the spark of life alive in a cooling body. The lack of fresh food, vitamins, and sunlight undermined health, making people vulnerable to disease and apathy. The winter diet was meager, monotonous, and required enormous effort to digest, which in itself took away precious energy from the body. The Vikings knew that winter did not forgive weakness, and any carelessness shown in summer or autumn would turn into tragedy in January. This time of year tested not only the body, but also the spirit, social ties, and loyalty within the community. It was in winter, when outdoor activity came to a standstill, that hidden work to sustain life, distribute resources, and preserve heat was in full swing inside the homes. Women, the keepers of the keys to the pantries, wielded power during this period comparable to that of a king in war. They decided who would receive how much food, balancing the fine line between the need to economize and the need to feed the workers. The elders told legends not only for entertainment, but also to distract the young from the oppressive silence and constant feeling of hunger. Stories about gods and heroes reminded them that winter was finite, and that even after the longest night, dawn would surely come. This belief was as important a tool for survival as warm furs or a sharp knife. The isolation of settlements from each other during the winter meant that there was no help to be expected, and each farmstead had to rely only on itself. If a fire broke out or supplies were spoiled, it was a death sentence for all the inhabitants of the house, which could not be appealed. Understanding this fragility of existence formed a special, fatalistic view of the world characteristic of northern peoples. It was in this icy blockade that the very Nordic character was formed, which would later terrify the shores of Europe with its steadfastness and ruthlessness. A person who had survived the Scandinavian winter on dried fish and sour milk was no longer afraid of the hardships of military life, or enemy arrows. Winter hunger was the forge in which the steel will of the conquerors of the seas and new lands was forged. I would be very interested to hear your opinion. Do you think modern man could survive even a month in such conditions without electricity and supermarkets? Write about it in the comments. Are you ready to learn the truth about why Vikings ate what we would today call spoiled food? In a world without refrigerators and preservatives, the only way to preserve food was to allow it to change under human control. The Vikings did not know the words bacteria or fermentation, but they were masters of the art of controlling decay in order to prolong life. They noticed that certain conditions allowed food to avoid spoiling completely and instead transition into a new, stable state suitable for long-term storage. This process, based on the work of lactic acid bacteria, turned perishable milk, meat, and fish into supplies that could survive the winter. The lack of sufficient salt, which was an expensive and rare imported commodity, forced them to look for alternative ways of preservation. One of the main preservatives was whey, which was left over after making cottage cheese or cheese and stored in huge barrels. This sour liquid created an environment in which putrefactive bacteria, which kill food and people, could not multiply. Pieces of meat, sausage, and even fish were immersed in barrels of whey, where they could be stored for months, acquiring a specific sour taste. Such food was far from the delicacies of modern cuisine, but it provided the most important thing: protein and calories necessary to maintain body temperature. The taste of the food changed dramatically, becoming sharp and rich. But for a hungry person, that didn't matter. The stomach's ability to digest such food was cultivated from childhood, and the Vikings' intestinal microflora was adapted to fermented products. A special place was given to the preparation of shark meat, which is poisonous when fresh due to its high urea content. The Vikings buried Greenland shark meat in the ground, allowing it to ferment and get rid of toxins naturally. This process took months and required precise knowledge of the timing so that the meat would become edible but not poisonous. Fermentation was also used to make various beverages and dairy products, which formed the basis of the winter diet. The famous skyr is not just yogurt, but the result of a complex fermentation process that preserves the nutritional properties of milk for a long time. These products were rich in probiotics, which supported people's immunity in conditions of vitamin and sunlight deficiency. The secrets of fermentation were passed down from generation to generation as the greatest treasure, because the life of the entire clan depended on them. A mistake in the technology could lead to the spoilage of an entire batch of supplies, which in winter conditions was tantamount to disaster. Masters who knew how to properly ferment fish or meat were as respected in the community as blacksmiths or shipbuilders. This method of food preservation was an example of the remarkable observation and ingenuity of ancient people who managed to tame the invisible forces of nature. They turned the process of decay, which usually brings death, into a source of life and energy for their people. Without this knowledge, the expansion of the Vikings would have been impossible, as they simply would not have been able to stockpile provisions for long voyages. Fermentation became the basis of Scandinavian culinary tradition, echoes of which we still see in modern dishes from northern countries. But even fermented meat could not compare to what we will discuss in the next chapter. What do you think the Vikings used when even rotten meat ran out? Want to know the secret that saved thousands of lives when hope seemed lost? In the harshest and most unforgiving winters, when the pantries were empty and there was no grain left, the Vikings turned their attention to the forest. At this critical moment, when hunger was already at the doorstep, trees ceased to be just a source of firewood or building material. People began to extract food that would seem completely inedible and even dangerous to modern humans. They sought salvation in what was usually considered waste. The resulting long strips of damp wood were hung out to dry over an open fire or in strong winds. The drying process continued until the strips lost all their moisture and became brittle and fragile, like glass. Only then could they be sent for processing, turning the wood into a food-like product. These dry strips were then ground into flour with great difficulty using heavy stone millstones. The resulting wood dust was usually mixed with the remains of barley or rye flour, if any had miraculously survived on the farm. In its pure form, wood flour did not have gluten, so it was impossible to bake anything whole from it without adding grain. Such bread turned out to be very dark, dense, bitter in taste, and incredibly heavy on the stomach. It gave a deceptive feeling of fullness, filling the stomach but provided little energy. The Vikings knew from bitter experience that it was impossible to eat only bark for a long time, as the human body is unable to digest cellulose. Eating pure wood bread led to severe pain, bloating, and serious digestive problems. It was not a complete meal, but rather a filler that allowed them to stave off hunger and stretch their meager supplies of real food. However, when mixed with grain, animal blood, or dried fish, this flour significantly increased the volume of food. This helped families hold out for a few more weeks until the first spring greens or the arrival of fish. It was a real ersatz product, invented by the northern peoples long before the world wars and food crises of the 20th century. The technology of survival had been perfected over centuries and passed down from parents to children as essential knowledge. The bark was usually harvested in early spring, when the trees began to actively sap after winter dormancy. At this time, the sapwood became the most nutritious, soft, and even sweet to the taste, thanks to the sugars rising from the roots. It was easier to remove the bark during this period, as it came away from the trunk on its own, filled with vitality. People waited for this moment as a celebration marking the end of the hungry winter. The consumption of bark bread was always considered a sign of extreme need, poverty, and social decline. Ancient sagas and chronicles mention this with bitterness, describing times when even the nobility were forced to eat bark. Rich and successful landowners prided themselves on the fact that such bread was never baked in their homes. However, it was this technology that allowed entire regions of Scandinavia to survive when crops were destroyed by early frosts or heavy rains. It was a grim but majestic symbol of human perseverance and unwillingness to give in to circumstances. People were ready to eat the earth and trees themselves, just so as not to give in to death and preserve the lives of their children. The history of the North is a history of constant struggle with nature for the right to exist. Archaeologists today find evidence of such a diet when analyzing the remains of people from the Viking era, which proves the massiveness of this phenomenon. The teeth of the ancient Scandinavians were often severely worn down, and the reason for this was precisely the coarse food with impurities. Stone chips from millstones and tough wood fibers acted like sandpaper, destroying enamel faster than time. But this was the price people paid for the chance to live through another winter. Interestingly, pine bark contained significant amounts of vitamin C, which ancient people were, of course, unaware of. Ironically, this circumstance often saved the starving from scurvy, which was a frequent companion of malnutrition. Surviving on the brink of exhaustion, they unwittingly obtained a cure for a dangerous disease directly from their meager food. Making this bread required special culinary skills and patience from the housewife. It was necessary to make this bitter mass at least minimally edible, so that the family could swallow it without disgust. Women soaked the bark in water for hours, changing it several times to wash out the resins and tannins. Then the raw materials were boiled for a long time in an attempt to improve the taste and soften the tough wood fibers at least a little. It was cooking at the limits of what was possible, where every step was dictated by harsh necessity rather than the desire to eat well. The health and mood of the whole family depended on the woman's ability to prepare this strange substance. It was a daily feat at the hearth, one that was rarely sung about in songs. The story of bark bread is an important reminder to us of how fragile and uncertain life was in that distant era. A person's fate depended entirely on the whims of nature, the weather, and the harvest, and there were no guarantees of safety. The Vikings did not just live in the forest, they were an integral part of its ecosystem, literally gnawing on trees for survival. Don't forget to like this if you are impressed by the ingenuity and resilience of the people of the past in their endless struggle against hunger. What if everything you've been taught about storing fish became obsolete 1,000 years ago? The Vikings created a product that could be stored for years without salt, cold, or airtight packaging, without losing its nutritional properties. This miracle product was dried cod or stockfish, which became the real gold of the North and the basis of its economy. The secret lay in the unique climate of northern Norway, where winter temperatures hover around 0 degrees. Fish were caught in huge quantities during spawning season, gutted and hung on wooden frames in the open air. The cold wind and sun slowly removed moisture from the carcasses, turning them into sticks as hard as wood. In this state, the fish lost 4/5 of its weight, but retained all its protein and nutrients in a concentrated form. Bacteria and insects could not reproduce at low temperatures and in dry winds, which ensured perfect preservation. The finished product could be stored in a dry barn for up to 10 years and remained edible. To eat such fish, it had to be beaten for a long time with a hammer or the back of an axe, breaking down the fibers. It was then soaked in water or eaten dry, like a kind of fish crisps during voyages. It was the ideal food for warriors and sailors, light, nutritious, and requiring no cooking. The production of dried fish was the first example of industrial food preservation in northern Europe at that time. The Vikings harvested it by the ton, not only for themselves, but also for trade with southern countries. This product became a currency with which they bought grain, fabrics, weapons, and jewelry from all over the world. The smell of drying fish was an integral part of the landscape of any coastal Viking settlement in the spring. Thousands of carcasses hanging in the wind were a symbol of wealth and confidence in the future for the entire community. It was a strategic reserve that ensured that people would not starve to death in winter. The drying technique was perfected down to the smallest detail. It was important to hang the fish so that the carcasses did not touch each other. If the fish touched, rot would start at the point of contact, which could spoil the entire catch. The slightest error in weather calculations could cause the fish to freeze and become brittle, or conversely, sour. Dried fish was so important that stealing or damaging someone else's catch was considered a serious crime, punishable by law. It was a resource that literally meant life for those who set off on long voyages across the Atlantic. Without supplies of dried cod, the discovery of Iceland, Greenland, and America would have been physically impossible. Even today, in Norway and Iceland, you can see the same wooden structures for drying fish that were used 1,000 years ago. This method has stood the test of time and remains unmatched in its simplicity and effectiveness. The Vikings learned to use wind energy to turn their ocean catch into a lasting food supply. What liquid do you think helped the Vikings digest this dry and tough food, warming them on long evenings? In the harsh conditions of the north, where ordinary water in streams quickly froze to the bottom or could become a source of deadly diseases, the Vikings relied on completely different drinks. Clean water was a luxury that was not always available, and stagnant moisture posed a threat of dysentery and fever. Therefore, thick ale and sweet honey were not just a fun way to pass the time at a noisy feast, but an essential strategic part of the daily survival diet. Without them, it would have been almost impossible to survive the long polar winter. Mead, or simply honey, was a much more expensive, difficult to prepare, and strong drink that was reserved for special occasions and sacred rituals. It was made from precious wild bee honey, the purest water, and rare spices or herbs that gave it a unique aroma. This golden nectar was considered the drink of gods and heroes, bringing not only joy, but also poetic inspiration and wisdom. Ordinary people could only afford honey on major holidays. Having large reserves of aged honey in the house eloquently spoke of the high social status and wealth of the owner. It demonstrated his ability to generously provide his dear guests with the best he had, without skimping on expenses. Treating someone to honey was a sign of special respect, and was often used when concluding important alliances or marriage contracts. The consumption of alcoholic beverages in winter also had a purely practical, physiological significance for maintaining heat exchange in an exhausted body. The calories contained in alcohol and sugars were absorbed instantly, entering directly into the bloodstream. This provided a quick and powerful surge of energy and warmth, which was so necessary in an icy house. A person felt a surge of strength, even if they were very tired. Of course, from a medical point of view, this was deceptive warmth caused by the dilation of blood vessels. But at that moment, it really helped to survive the piercing cold. When your teeth were chattering from the cold, a mug of hot, strong drink could be a lifesaver. It allowed you to relax your muscles, which had been tensed by the cold, and fall asleep peacefully under the fur skins. Feasts with abundant libations served an important social function, bringing people locked in a confined space by bad weather closer together. Drinking ale together from one huge horn or a common bowl was a sacred sign of trust and unbreakable brotherhood. Passing the horn around, each participant in the feast confirmed their loyalty to the community and the Jarl, sharing the same fate with them. This helped to effectively relieve the psychological tension and aggression that inevitably arose in a close-knit male community during long winter isolation. Over a mug of ale, disputes were resolved, old grudges were forgotten, and plans were made for future summer expeditions. Alcohol loosened tongues and allowed people to speak their minds, which was a kind of therapy at the time. The technology of brewing was sacred secret knowledge, and women who knew how to brew good and tasty ale were held in high esteem in society. The mistress of the house, who knew the secrets of malt and hops, was considered the guardian of the family's well-being, because the health of the household depended on her skills. It was believed that the mysterious process of fermentation was controlled by invisible spirits, and it was treated with superstitious awe and caution. To start fermentation, special magic sticks with live yeast cultures were used, which were carefully passed down in the family from mother to daughter. This stick was dipped into the wort, reviving the drink, and then dried and hidden until the next brewing. Losing such a stick was considered a bad omen, as the family could be left without bread and ale. The grain used for brewing ale was never wasted, as throwing away food was a crime. The pulp left over after filtering the wort was often used to bake coarse bread or flatbread for slaves. It was also an excellent and high-calorie food for livestock, helping the animals survive the winter. Heavy drinking was a kind of sacrifice, and a way to show the higher powers that the community had surplus and was not afraid of the future. People believed that the more ale was drunk and spilled on the ground during these days, the richer the harvest would be the following year. Revelry and hops were a challenge to death and darkness, which reigned outside the walls of the longhouse. Beverages were stored in huge wooden barrels bound with iron or wooden hoops. These containers were always kept in the warmest and most protected part of the house, away from doors, so that the contents would not freeze or spoil. The condition of the ale was monitored as carefully and zealously as the health of livestock or the sharpness of weapons. Sour or spoiled drink was a real tragedy for the family, as it meant the loss of a huge amount of grain and labor. A farmer whose ale turned to vinegar could become a laughing stock for his neighbors and lose their respect. Therefore, the barrels were checked regularly, and children were strictly punished for approaching them without permission. It was a truly strategic liquid, without which the meager winter diet of northerners would have been incomplete and even life-threatening. Ale gave exhausted people the strength they needed, life-saving warmth, and a little simple human joy in a harsh world. In conditions of piercing cold, eternal darkness, and hard physical labor, a mug of this drink was a symbol of hope. Are you ready for the shocking truth about how the Vikings prepared for winter? October in the Viking world was called the month of slaughter, or Gormand, and it was a time of blood and hard work. It was impossible to keep all the livestock through the winter. There simply wasn't enough hay harvested during the short summer. Therefore, most of the animals had to be killed so that only the most valuable ones would survive. This was not cruelty, but the harsh mathematics of survival, where the life of an animal was exchanged for the life of a human. Every cow, sheep, or pig that could not be fed was turned into a set of products for the winter. No part of the carcass was wasted. Everything from horns and hooves to blood and entrails was used. The blood was collected in large vats and used to make blood sausages and puddings, mixed with grain and fat. These foods were rich in iron and nutrients necessary to combat winter weakness. Blood foods were the first to be prepared, as they spoiled the fastest. The meat was cut up and preserved. It was salted if salt was available, but more often it was smoked or dried. Huge pieces of ham and bacon were hung under the roof of a longhouse, where the smoke from the hearth permeated them. A layer of soot created a protective film that repelled flies and prevented the meat from rotting. The animals' heads were chopped off, the brains removed, or boiled whole to make jelly, which solidified in the cold. The intestines were used to make casings for sausages, and the stomachs were used as containers for storing rennet and oil. Even the bones were cracked open to extract the nutritious bone marrow, which was added to soups. This period required tremendous effort from the entire community, who worked from dawn to dusk. The men slaughtered and butchered the livestock, while the women washed, cooked, salted, and stuffed sausages. A mistake in processing could result in the meat spoiling by midwinter, condemning the family to starvation. Fat was a separate commodity. It was melted down and stored in pots, used both for food and for lighting. Lard was the main source of energy, allowing the body to generate heat in severe frosts. Without enough fat, a person would quickly freeze and lose strength. Animal skins were immediately processed to make warm clothes, shoes, and blankets. Sheep's wool was used to make yarn, which was woven into thick fabric that protected against wind and moisture. The death of animals gave people a second skin that could withstand the icy breath of winter. The atmosphere during the slaughter was solemn and gloomy, mixed with joy at the abundance of fresh meat. Feasts were held, at which perishable parts such as the liver, kidneys, and heart were eaten. It was the last feast before a long period of strict economy and moderation. The Great Slaughter was the boundary between a well-fed autumn and a hungry winter, a ritual of transition to a different way of life. Do you think you could butcher an animal to provide yourself with food? Do you know how the Vikings extracted vitamins from sea giants in the next chapter? For coastal dwellers, the sea remained a source of sustenance even when the land was bound by ice and snow. Hunting marine mammals, seals, walruses, and whales provided resources that could not be obtained on land. It was a dangerous but incredibly profitable activity that provided the community with unique products. Seal meat was dark, fatty, and rich in protein, but the main treasure was seal blubber. It was used not only for food, dipping dried fish in it, but also as fuel for lamps. During the polar night, it was seal blubber that provided light, dispelling the darkness in longhouses. Seal hunting required patience and skill. Hunters lay on the ice for hours, waiting for their prey at the holes. One successful harpoon strike could provide a family with food and light for several weeks. Seal skins were used to make waterproof shoes and clothing for sailors. Whale meat was a rare but coveted delicacy, and most often it was obtained by the Vikings by chance. A whale washed ashore was considered a gift from the gods and the property of the person on whose land it ended up. Cutting up a whale carcass was a public event in which all the inhabitants of the surrounding farms participated. Huge layers of whale blubber and meat were cut off and preserved in pits with sour whey or salted. This meat was tough and had a distinctive taste, but it contained a huge amount of energy. Whale blubber was also an invaluable source of vitamin D, which was sorely lacking in winter. Walruses were valued primarily for their tusks, which were the expensive ivory of the north. But their meat and their strong, thick skin were also put to good use. The skin was cut into ship ropes. Ropes made from walrus skin were so strong that they did not break even in the strongest storms. Eating the liver and fat of marine animals saved the Vikings from rickets and other diseases. Their intuitive understanding of nutrition helped them balance their diet even in the complete absence of vegetables and fruits. They ate everything the sea had to offer without turning their noses up at anything. Seafood, such as shellfish and seaweed, was also collected during low tides in areas that did not freeze. Seaweed was a source of salt and minerals. It was dried and added to soups or bread. It was the food of the poor, but in times of famine, it saved the lives of many. The attitude toward sea hunting was imbued with respect for the power of the beast and the elements. Killing a whale or walrus was a feat that was celebrated in songs and sagas. It was a battle between equals, where man prevailed thanks to his cunning and courage. The sea provided fat and meat, but comfort and warmth were created inside the home. The place where the Vikings and their families spent their entire winter life was the longhouse. It was a unique architectural structure created by ancient craftsmen specifically to preserve precious heat in the harsh climate. It was a low, elongated building with characteristic curved walls, which outwardly resembled a sea vessel turned upside down. This shape was chosen not by chance and not for beauty, but out of a harsh necessity for survival. The design of the house was ingeniously thought out by the engineers of the past to withstand squalls and bitter frosts as effectively as possible. The streamlined shape of the roof and walls allowed the wind to glide over the surface without encountering stiff resistance and without cooling the room. The house seemed to press itself to the ground, trying to become part of the landscape rather than compete with it. This made it stable even in the strongest winter storms. The walls were built from the most accessible and reliable materials that nature could provide in a particular region. In wooded areas, thick logs were used, with the gaps between them carefully sealed with clay or manure for airtightness. In treeless areas, such as Iceland, the walls were made of thick layers of peat and stone, creating powerful barriers. Peat was an excellent natural insulator, creating a thermos effect inside the room. Along the long walls were wide wooden benches raised above the earthen floor. During the day, they served as seats for work and meals, and at night, they turned into beds for all the household members. Personal belongings, tools, and chests of clothes were usually stored under these benches. All life took place on these raised platforms, away from the cold ground. Everyone slept together in one big pile, covered with warm fur skins and woolen blankets. People huddled close together with their backs to each other for mutual warmth, as a single person could freeze by morning. Physical closeness was the most natural and effective way to keep warm in the bitter cold. The concept of personal space and intimacy practically disappeared in winter for the sake of collective survival. Often, the most valuable livestock, cows or sheep, were kept in one of the fenced-off parts of the house. This was done not only to protect the animals from predators and frost, but also for the benefit of humans. The warmth of large animals helped to further heat the air in the living quarters. The breath of the livestock mixed with the breath of the people, creating a single ecosystem of warmth. The smell in the longhouse was thick, complex, and incredibly rich. It was a pungent mixture of acrid smoke, the aromas of food cooking in cauldrons, the smell of dried fish, sheep's wool, and unwashed human bodies. Wet clothes drying by the fire added their own notes to this heavy bouquet. For a modern, sterile person, this smell would probably be unbearable and suffocating. But for a Viking, this smell meant the most important things: home, satiety, safety, and life itself. The walls, smoked over the years and covered with a layer of shiny soot, absorbed the history of many generations of one family. Soot, by the way, served as an excellent antiseptic, protecting the wood from rot and insects. This smell was the smell of survival in a world where death reigned outside. Strategic food reserves hung along the walls and directly under the smoke-stained ceiling on beams. There you could see smoked pork hams, long bundles of dried cod, sacks of precious grain, and bunches of medicinal herbs. The smoke from the hearth further preserved these products, protecting them from spoilage and pests. The house was simultaneously a dwelling, a huge warehouse, and a workshop. The earthen floor was often covered with a layer of fresh straw, reeds, or fir branches. This bedding was changed as it became dirty to keep the house relatively dry and clean. Old dirty straw was burned or thrown away and replaced with fragrant herbs or fresh fir branches. This helped to combat the dampness that came from the ground. Cleanliness in such conditions was a relative concept, but the owners tried their best to maintain order. This was necessary to avoid outbreaks of disease and the spread of parasites such as fleas and lice. In cramped and crowded conditions, hygiene became a matter of survival for the whole group. This house was a reliable fortress against winter, a kind of ark floating through the snowstorm to the long-awaited spring. Dairy products were not just food, but a real currency and strategic reserve for the Vikings. In the summer, when cows produced a lot of milk on lush pastures, the mass production of butter and cheese began. These products had high energy value and could be stored for a very long time when properly processed. Viking butter was very different from what we are used to today. It was made very salty to prevent spoilage, or fermented to give it a sour taste. Such butter was not spread thinly on bread, but eaten in chunks or added to porridge and soups. There was a unique way of storing butter, which archaeologists call bog butter. Wooden boxes of butter were buried in cold peat bogs, where the absence of oxygen and low temperature preserved the product. In such an environment, the butter could lie for years, acquiring a waxy texture and a specific taste. This oil was so valuable that it was used to pay taxes, fines, and land rent. Accumulated oil reserves were an indicator of a family's wealth and its ability to survive crop failures. Pieces of 1,000-year-old bog oil found today prove the effectiveness of this method. Cheese was also made in huge quantities using rennet from calf stomachs. Hard and soft cheeses were an excellent source of protein and calcium in winter. Smoked cheese could be stored hanging from the ceiling of the house without spoiling for months. Gamelost, an old cheese that was deliberately aged until mold appeared, was particularly popular. It had a pungent smell and taste, but was considered a remedy for many diseases. The Vikings believed that this cheese gave warriors strength and strengthened the stomach. Skyr, a thick, sour milk product similar to cottage cheese, was a daily food. It was stored in barrels with whey, where it could stand all winter without losing its properties. Skyr was eaten with honey or berries, if available, or simply with water. Dairy products were the staple food for children and the elderly, who found it difficult to chew tough meat. They provided the body with the fats necessary for brain function and immune support. Without dairy farming, survival in the north would have been impossible. Cows were a Viking's greatest treasure, and they were cherished more than anything else, often living under the same roof as people. Losing a cow in winter was a tragedy comparable to losing a family member. It was a living food factory, running on grass and hay. Stockpiling milk required planning and discipline, qualities for which Scandinavian housewives were renowned. When the winter sun began to linger in the sky longer than usual, and the blackened snow slowly settled, the most dangerous period of the year began. It was a time called spring famine, and it was often feared more than the harshest frosts. By this point, the pantry supplies were running critically low, and the barns were empty, swept clean of every last grain. The old food was gone, and the new food had not yet grown, been born, or been caught. It was during this deceptive time, when nature seemed to be awakening, that people most often died of exhaustion. Their stomachs ached from emptiness, and every day became a test of willpower. People waited impatiently and hopefully for the first green shoots to timidly break through the frozen and damp earth. Any green sprout was seen as a promise of life and imminent salvation. Stinging nettles, sour sorrel, and fragrant angelica were the first harbingers of the end of famine, and a source of long-awaited vitamins. Women and children, armed with baskets and knives, set out in search of these inconspicuous plants as soon as the first patches of thawed ground appeared in the fields. They combed every inch of land, gathering young shoots, which were more valuable than gold at that time. Thick green soups were cooked over open fires from young nettles, adding whatever else could be found. After long months of eating tough salted meat and dried fish, this simple broth seemed like divine nectar to people. The fresh taste of greens reminded them that winter had receded and gave them hope for the coming warmth. It was the first fresh food in 6 months, and their bodies accepted it with gratitude. The return of migratory birds and the beginning of mass fish spawning meant the final and irrevocable retreat of starvation. When schools of fish entered the fjords freed from ice, all men capable of holding a net or harpoon went out to fish. Fresh fish, fried on charcoal, was a real feast for stomachs exhausted by dry food.
The earth is our living partner, and
At the same time, daredevils set off for bird markets located on inaccessible cliffs. The first eggs of seabirds were an exquisite delicacy, rich in protein, for which people literally risked their lives, climbing over slippery rocks. Each egg obtained was a small victory over hunger and brought joy to the home. At this time, the surviving domestic animals were taken out of their dark barns for the first time and put out to graze on the sparse spring pastures. Over the winter, they had become thin and weak, and their muscles had often atrophied from standing in cramped quarters for so long. Often, the owners had to carry the cows and sheep in their arms, as the animals were too exhausted to walk on their own. But the main thing was that they were alive and could produce offspring and milk. The sight of cows grazing on the first green grass was a powerful symbol that the annual cycle of life had come full circle and continued. It meant that the family would have milk, butter, and meat, and that life on the farm was getting back on track. The people who managed to survive this winter felt like true victors in a deadly battle with ruthless nature. Their bodies were exhausted, their faces gaunt, but their spirits were tempered by the harsh trials of cold and constant hunger. They knew that the worst was behind them, and that the sun awaited them ahead. It was this spring energy of survival, mixed with joy, that pushed them to new achievements and feats. As soon as their physical strength was restored, active preparations for summer military and trade expeditions began. People were eager for activity, seeking to compensate for months of forced inactivity. As soon as the ice completely melted from the water, bustling work began on the shore to prepare the warships, dracars. The air smelled of heated resin, which was used to caulk the sides, and the sound of axes and saws could be heard. Men repaired sails, checked ropes, and recruited crews from the strongest and most fortunate warriors. Those who had managed to stay strong and healthy during the winter were ready to set sail in search of riches, new lands, and eternal glory. Surviving the winter was just a tough prelude to the main part of the year, the Vikings' summer expansion. The sea called to them, promising rewards for their hardships. Spring was a time of great hopes, weddings, and new beginnings for the entire community. It was a time when the world, which had shrunk to the size of a single house during winter, once again became vast and full of possibilities. Young couples who had been waiting for the warmth could finally start their families and build their homes. The heavy doors of the longhouses swung open, letting in the fresh spring air and bright sunlight. This allowed the darkness, dampness, and heavy, musty smell that had accumulated during the long months of isolation to be driven out of the dwellings. The community became whole again, ready to work together in the fields and wage war on foreign shores. This annual recurring cycle of death and rebirth shaped the unique and harsh worldview of the Vikings. They valued life particularly keenly because they knew from experience how easily and quickly it could be lost in the darkness of winter. Death was always close at hand, making the taste of life brighter. And that is why they knew how to sincerely enjoy the simplest and most basic things that we often overlook. The warm sun on their faces, the green grass under their feet, and a full stomach of simple food were the greatest happiness for them. Spring was proof that life always triumphs over death. The story of the Vikings' winter diet is not a saga about food, but about incredible human resilience and ingenuity. We saw how they turned bark into bread, rot into a delicacy, and cold into an ally. Their ability to survive in conditions incompatible with life commands no less respect than their military exploits. These people didn't just endure winter, they learned to control it, creating preservation techniques that were ahead of their time. Every piece of dried fish or sip of sour ale was a small victory over death. And perhaps it was this harsh school of survival that made them legends whose names we still remember today. What part of the Viking diet did you find most extreme? Bark bread or fermented shark? Suggest topics for future videos that you would like to learn more about in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new journeys into the past.